In this video, we will pick up where the last video left off at the end of the Middle Ages and continue all the way to the present. This period, represented in grey on the bar at the bottom of the screen, is called the Postmedieval Period by archaeologists. Historians tend to divide it into two sections, the Early Modern Period in pink here, and the Modern Period in blue, the transition between them being in around 1700 or 1750 AD. I've marked the end of the Middle Ages, in orange and red, as 1485, the end of the Wars of the Roses. That's the second of the two red lines at the top. This is the traditional date for the end of the English Middle Ages, but we might consider the Postmedieval Period or the Early Modern Period to have begun in, for example, 1453, at the end of the Byzantine Empire. That's the purple line. The beginning of the Reformation in the early 16th century. The beginning of the Renaissance, which is during the 14th century, more or less the left-hand side of the screen, but in Britain and much of Northern Europe really begins around 1500. The post-medieval period is also the one in which many European countries began to establish overseas empires, the age of colonialism. We might even use the voyage of Vasco da Gama around the Cape of Good Hope to Asia in 1497, or that of Columbus across the Atlantic in 1492, as the start of the post-medieval era, because colonialism is such an important feature of it. Empires continued to expand and develop throughout the post-medieval era. For instance, the English East India Company was founded in 1600 AD, the Virginia colony settled in 1619, and British colonization of Australia began in 1788. So, the normal way to divide this period up, certainly in England at any rate, is by the reigns of kings and queens. So the first period of the post-medieval era is the Tudor period, 1485 to 1603, represented this in yellow. Begins with Henry VII, and then Henry VIII, and then Henry VIII's children. The last of the Tudor monarchs, Elizabeth I, her reign lasted relatively long in comparison to her siblings, and it was also a period of relative political stability, so it's a relatively important period, so it's often given its own name, the Elizabethan period, which we've represented in orange, but it is part of the Tudor period, and her reign was 1558 to 1603. Elizabeth I left no children, so her death began a new royal dynasty, the Stuarts, who were already kings of Scotland. James I of England, who was James VI of Scotland, became king and founded the Stuart dynasty. As the reign of James I was particularly long, it is often called the Jacobean period, represented here in dark blue. This is not to be confused with the Jacobite rebellions, which occurred much later, in 1715 and 1745, during the Georgian period. And the Stuarts were on the throne, well, in broad terms, right up to 1714, but it was a very turbulent time, so it's not quite that straightforward. In the middle of the period, there is the English Civil War, the dispute between Charles I, the son of James I, and Parliament. Charles I loses, is beheaded, and no new king is crowned to replace him, so we begin a period called the interregnum between the reigns, which we've represented in grey. And sometimes this is called the Commonwealth. That's the type of government that was formed, and strictly speaking, it took a couple of years for the Commonwealth to be organised, so in very strict terms, it's not quite the Commonwealth period is not quite the interregnum. It's a little bit shorter, but they're often used interchangeably. The Commonwealth didn't last very long after the death of Oliver Cromwell, who was the head of it as Lord Protector. And so Charles II, the son of Charles I, was invited back to become King of England. He'd already been considered King in Scotland from the point of his father's death. This period, in which Charles II is restored to the throne, is called the Restoration. And some people consider the Restoration to go only until the end of the reign of Charles II. Some people would say it was the end of the reign of his successor, James II. We've put it here as the right up to the end of the Stuart period, and that's a chronology that's often used by people who study cultural history of this period, the theatre especially. In the middle of what we're calling here the Restoration period, in 1688, there's an event called the Glorious Revolution. It's a bit of a funny term. It has to do with the way that this was considered by historians of English constitutional history a century and a bit ago. It's not necessarily considered to be quite such a positive thing by everyone now. What happened was that the nobility had a dispute with James II and deposed him, and invited his sister and her husband, Mary and William of Orange, who was a Dutch prince, to rule England together. And they're succeeded after William III's death, William of Orange's death, by Queen Anne, who reigns until 1714. She's the last of the Stuarts. The Georgian period comes next. It's quite a long period. It goes across the divide between the early modern and the modern periods, if you consider that divide come at 1750, which is how we've represented it here. It covers the reigns of George I through to George IV. It often includes, and is represented here as including, the reign of William IV, who didn't reign for very long, only 1830 to 1837, and came immediately after George IV. The Georges, William IV, and Queen Victoria were members of the royal house of Hanover, and so their reigns are often collectively referred to as the Hanoverian period, which is green here. This term is especially used for the reigns of the four Georges. Very occasionally, the early 18th century, that is, the reigns of Queen Anne through the first two Georges, is known as the Augustan Age, especially by those who study literature. This is because literary critics of the time compared this era to the reign of the Emperor Augustus in ancient Rome. In the middle, or really towards the end actually, of the Georgian period, between 1811 and 1820, there's a period that's called the Regency. It's part of the Georgian period, and it occurs because George III famously became very ill towards the end of his life, physically and mentally, but it was really the mental illness that meant that he could no longer really rule as king, and so his son, also called George, became Prince Regent and took over the day-to-day running of the country. We represented this Regency period in purple, and George, Prince Regent, became George IV upon his father's death. The Victorian period comes next, when Queen Victoria becomes queen in 1837, and she reigned until 1901, which represented this in brown. And then the Edwardian period follows that immediately, represented here in black. It lasts strictly until 1910, although very often the 4 years between Edward VII's death and the First World War is sometimes combined into it because it's such a short period and it's culturally very similar. Also, it's the Edwardian period really is very similar in many ways, culturally and socially, to the Victorian period, so sometimes it's also subsumed in that. Some people will say Victorian up until the First World War. Just before we leave the pre-20th century, part of the post-medieval period, I just want to discuss two other little periods, or quite long periods, that are talked about: the long 18th century and the long 19th century. And these are used when historians are writing about social, economic, or political events or processes which happen mainly in the 19th century or mainly in the 18th century, but start a little before or a little bit after or both. The long 18th century is usually taken to be 1688 through to the 1830s, so the Glorious Revolution through to the reign of George IV, and the long 19th century is usually considered about 1800 to about 1914. A few really important social and economic changes and some really important wars that occurred during the post-medieval period that themselves are often spoke about as periods of history. And I just want to point out a few of those so you can see how they relate to those traditional periods of British history defined by the reigns of monarchs. So there's the 30 Years' War, about 1618, 1648. Covers most of Europe. It's major economic disruption, and it sets up the political order of the following centuries. Doesn't involve Britain, although it comes just before and during the English Civil War. And the other really important one is the Napoleonic War. Similarly, engulfs most of Europe and causes major economic disruption. And that lasts 1803 to 1850. But really the most important features of this period are the social and cultural and scientific changes that occur. So the Renaissance is the first of these. And it's really the rediscovery of Roman and classical culture. Not that it had been forgotten, but it begins to get looked at more broadly and emulated more closely. The Renaissance begins in Italy around the early to mid 14th century and goes on to sometime towards the end of the 16th century. But in Britain and Northern Europe, really, it's more restricted to the 16th century, and it's the blue line here. The Reformation, which is where some groups of Christians broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, which had been dominant in medieval Europe. And it begins with 1517, really, with the publication by a priest called Martin Luther of some criticism of the Roman Catholic Church. In England, it begins around 1529 or 1530 when some powerful members of the court began advocating these ideas, advocating Protestantism, and persuaded the king to adopt it. It's not really clear when the Reformation ends, but I've placed it in the mid-17th century at the end of the 30 Years' War, but there are many other dates that you could pick, but people really, if they're referring to the Reformation period, are talking about the 16th century through to the early part of the 17th. Another important event is the scientific revolution of the 17th century. People like Galileo and Newton begin to think about the world in new ways, investigate it using experiment. And most importantly, this leads on into the Enlightenment, which we've represented here in peach, of the 18th century, and that's a period in which intellectuals begin to embrace the idea of rationality and begin to approach economic and political problems in ways that we would recognise as modern ways of thinking. They begin to approach the problems of the day in ways that we would consider to be common sense, but which would not have appeared so to people of the Middle Ages. The Industrial Revolution also occurs in this period. Exactly what the Industrial Revolution is not entirely agreed upon, but it certainly involves mechanization, often in factories, of the manufacture of particular goods, especially using steam power, and mainly for an export market. It begins around the early to mid 18th century, continues through to the early or mid 19th century, and then sometimes you will come across historians talking of a second industrial revolution. This is in the late 19th century into the very early 20th, and it's associated with technologies like electricity and radio. If people refer to the Industrial Revolution, though, they're usually referring to the first. And then finally, there's the Agricultural Revolution. This is a period of major and quite rapid increase in agricultural productivity, that is, the amount of food produced per agricultural labourer or per acre of land. And some people, particularly historians writing in the 1960s and 1970s, believe that this occurred quite early on in the 16th or 17th centuries. But more recently, people using quantified data, quantitative data, have placed it in the middle of the 18th century and into the 19th century. But certainly there were important technological developments in the early modern period, even if they did not lead directly to productivity increase at that time. So let's stretch out the timeline once more and look in detail at the 20th century. And this period tends to be dominated by the two world wars between 1914 and 1918, or 1919 if you take it to the signing of the actual peace treaty, and 1939 to 1945 for the Second World War. Although especially for the Second World War, there were important conflicts which began further back in the 1930s and led into the Second World War as we would consider it usually. And it's important to take those into account. And because these events, these two wars, dominate the 20th century, they're usually used to divide it up. So the time in between them, the 1920s and the 1930s, is usually called the interwar period. We've represented that here as yellow. Importantly, this includes a period called the Great Depression, a period of great economic hardship, which begins in 1929 with the stock market crash, the Wall Street crash. In southern Britain, this only really lasted until about 1933, that's the dark grey area. But in the industrialised north of England, in South Wales, and central Scotland, it really lasted until the beginning of the Second World War, but did improve a little from about 1937 when rearmament began to really intensify. That's the light grey area. After the Second World War, there's the post-war period. Sometimes people use post-war to mean everything from 1945 up to present. Some people will use it for the, or say, decade and a bit after 1945, so the period immediately after the war. But it's usually obvious from context which is meant. And this is also the Cold War. It's represented in orange. This is the tension between the Soviet bloc, based around the USSR and what's become Russia, and NATO, which particularly led by the United States and to a lesser extent Western European countries. Some people would consider this to begin immediately after the Second World War, so in 1945, which is what we have represented here, but some people would consider it to date from the Berlin crisis and the Berlin airlift, 1947, when the Soviet Union closed off certain access routes to the Western-controlled parts of Berlin. Other people might consider the formation of NATO in 1949 to be the beginning of the Cold War. In any case, it lasts until either 1989, when the Berlin Wall was pulled down and East and West Germany reunified into the modern country, or in 1991, when the USSR was dissolved. And then between the beginning of the 90s and 2000, we have a period in which there isn't really a name. And then we have, of course, in the last 21 years, 21st century. Now, that's not to say that history ended in 1991, and obviously it didn't. We've seen lots of important things happen since then, many of them in the current century, 9/11 and the resulting wars, economic collapse in 2008, the Arab Spring, computing technologies developing at pace, and of course, most recently and still ongoing, COVID-19. Even whilst this video has been in production, Russia has invaded Ukraine, an event likely to have repercussions for many decades. But the periods in which the historians of the future will divide the era in which we live haven't yet been named, haven't yet been fixed. We don't know what will actually turn out to be important. But one day, some of these events will be used to divide and name periods of history.